Elizabeth Buckingham is our next speaker. She is Foreign Affairs Officer at the U.S. State Department, and she's going to tell us about the opportunities the Global Food Security Act can offer at this time.
Thank you, and thank you to IFPRI for hosting this. Thank you for putting together such a valuable report. My office at the State Department within the Office of Global Food Security has been really interested in this topic for several years now. We were heavily involved in the Habitat 3 conference last year, and this report is something where we've been cobbling together pieces of information, and this report lays it out in one really solid product, so I'm really pleased to see this. I do want to talk a little bit about the topic before I get into the Global Food Security Act, and just frame it with 2 points. I don't want to get into a lot of stats. We heard a lot of that today, but the one that is most striking to me is that 90% of urbanization between now and 2050 will happen in Africa and Asia, and this point was made, and so I won't harp on it too long, but those are the areas that we're already working, where we're already seeing much of our food insecurity and malnutrition where it is hit the hardest. We're going to overlay on top of that this rapid urbanization, and just the fact that that is happening makes the case for why we need to be thinking about urban food security. The other case I will make for this, which I've been making for several years now, well, 2 years now, is that we live in the world of the SDGs. Under the SDGs, we said that we would end hunger. That's our goal. By 2030, we're going to end hunger. Under the MDGs, we said we would have it. If we were going to have it, we could choose what populations we work in, and we could find the populations where we could make the most impact. If we say we're going to end it, that means we have to end it everywhere it exists, which is rural areas and which is urban areas. So if we're serious about meeting the SDGs, that means we have to be serious about urban food insecurity and urban malnutrition. So another way just to frame this, and I think we heard a lot of it today, but I think that this rural-urban spectrum, there's not necessarily a common understanding of what we mean. So when I think about that, when I talk about that, I'm thinking about the whole food system and how it meets the needs of urban to rural populations. So that's rural transformation, which is much of what the food security world has been doing for many years. That's also those rural-urban linkages and looking at that value chain and getting from farm to market. And it's also what is now the kind of nascent topic that we are discussing, which is urban food security. And we heard this a little bit, so we won't get into it, but what are the unique food security and nutrition needs of the urban poor? We hear about social protection, we hear about how it's about purchasing power, we hear about the nutrition transition, and so those are things that we really need to consider, because that's different than what it looks like in rural areas. I would also say that within these kind of 3 buckets, I would hit on 3 things that we have found are incredibly important to be able to address food security across the rural and urban spectrum. The first, and I was so glad to hear it from several people, is data. We don't know where the poor live, and we don't know what their food insecurity is. And I know that's a fairly bold statement, especially in front of a room of researchers and academics. But we heard it from Vimlandra that we don't have a definition of rural versus urban. So if you tell me that 75% of the world's poor live in rural areas, I'm going to ask you, how are you defining rural? We also know that most poverty and food insecurity data only measures at the national level and doesn't get down to the granular level at the subnational. And we also know that poverty data doesn't account for price differences between rural and urban areas. So if a tomato costs 30 cents in a rural market and $3 in an urban market, yet we're still measuring poverty at the same level in that country, it just doesn't capture the picture of what poverty actually looks like. So yes, we need more data, and I'm so glad to hear that several times already today. The second thing I think we need to do is build the expertise. When we're talking especially about rural-urban linkages in the value chain, we're not just talking about ag production, and I heard that today from Schengen. We're talking about lots of areas and sectors that we're not real experts in. Transportation, infrastructure, energy systems, communication. We need that to build those strong value chains. And so we need to find those experts and bring them into this conversation. And then thirdly, I would say that we really need to improve the business environment. Like I said, to me, rural-urban food security is food systems meeting the needs of the rural and urban poor, and a robust food system is inherently a strong ag and food industry. And so we need to build that. We need to work with cities to find ways to have enabling policies that encourages investment. We need to work with the informal sector and make sure that those policies are there. So those are some of the 3 things that I think are the most important for this topic. But now I want to switch a little bit to what some of the policy opportunities are to work on this. We heard about the SDGs. We heard about Habitat 3, the New Urban Agenda. Those are two kind of overarching international agreements that we can work on, which both talk about food security, and in the New Urban Agenda, urban food security. But what we don't have with those two things is a forcing mechanism that makes us work together. That's something that is a challenge for us that we have to take on ourselves. If we're really serious about linking SDG 2 and SDG 11, how are we doing it? Where are those groups? How are those two worlds working together? I would also point out two other global policy opportunities where we can work on this. One is the G7. So the G7 is a great success story on how there can be incremental change on these topics. So last year within the G7, the food security communique had the first reference ever to urban food security, which was a huge boon for us. We were very excited about that. And now this year, as we're starting to negotiate what the Taormina Initiative is going to be, urban is already on there. It's on the starting plate, and it's just about how we build it out, how we build on that success. So I think all of this is often very incremental, and those small steps really build to a larger product. And then I would say another example is the G20. So this year, under the Germany's presidency, the G20 focused on rural youth employment and Africa, which is hugely important, lots of reasons why that's very relevant right now. It's very much focused on that rural transformation piece, but while some people will say, well, that's about rural, it's not about urban, we need to find these areas to be strategic about how rural transformation is about urbanization. Because if we're really going to find ways to transform rural areas, we're going to need to have those markets in those urban areas, we're going to need to have those strong value chains that link across. We're going to have to take the opportunity to give the youth capacity to become the agribusiness, small and medium enterprise owners, to make that value chain very robust. So that is a good opportunity where we can insert urbanization into what would otherwise be a very rural-focused conversation. And then lastly, I do want to speak just briefly about the Global Food Security Act. So as you know, our U.S. government is in transition, and in terms of what the priorities of our new administration are going to be, a lot of those are still forthcoming. But one thing that is new and that we can talk about is the Global Food Security Act, which some of you may be familiar with. Last year, our Congress passed into legislation this act with strong bipartisan support. It builds on what we have been able to accomplish in Feed the Future and required a strategy, a whole-of-government interagency strategy that would guide our work for the next 5 years. So we, the U.S. government, a whole laborious, painful process, interagency process over the last 6 months or so, have developed this strategy. The overarching goal really does align with the SDGs, as should all of our work. Our goal is to sustainably reduce global hunger, malnutrition, and poverty. And it has 3 main objectives. The first objective is inclusive and sustainable agricultural-led growth. The second is strengthened resilience among people and systems. And the third is a well-nourished population. And I would say that those 3 objectives fit very nicely into those 3 buckets of rural transformation, of value chains and systems, and a well-nourished population, whether you're in a rural area or an urban area. The GFSS, the Global Food Security Strategy, really builds on what we learned from Feed the Future, but it also takes into account the global changes that we've seen over the last 8 years. It allows for a broader definition of food security so that we can work on some of these challenges that haven't always been part of the conversation, like urbanization. So if you're familiar with Feed the Future, what's new about the Global Food Security Strategy? I would point out a couple things. One is there's a stronger commitment to the WASH community, water, sanitation, and hygiene, and those linkages to nutrition. Secondly, we are really looking at the kind of long-term strategy that's strengthening capacity, systems, policy, and markets is the long-term solution to food security. We have a strong focus on youth and a renewed commitment to gender integration, and most importantly and relevant to this conversation is that prioritizing of rural-urban linkages and investments along that value chain. And it's very much built into the strategy, and there's lots of space to work that. So I would just say, as my closing point, I think a lot of times in this food security community, there's a bit of a tension between the rural folks and the urban folks, and it's seen as if we turn and pivot to urban that we're not going to be working on rural. But it's not a zero-sum game. There's an inherent interdependence between rural areas and urban areas, and I think that if we step back and take that regional approach and look at the circular work, as Luis had mentioned, and kind of look at that virtuous cycle where we can use rural areas to catalyze urban areas and that whole cycle, that we'll see that we can have growth along the value chain, and that, as we heard from Melandra, it really is a win-win situation. Thank you.